which we will share via this email list. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll hand it off to Anna for her introduction.
Hello, my name is Anna Cinco. I'm a risk assessor at MPCA, and I'll be talking about more of the technical information in this presentation. And I'll hand it off to Cassandra.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are here for the air toxics regulations rulemaking information session. I'm Cassandra Meyer. I'm an engineer in the air policy unit at MPCA, and I am the technical lead for this rulemaking. And just another reminder as people are logging in that we are recording this presentation. Right. If you joined us or watched the recordings of some of the presentations from last year, I'll cover some of the same content in the beginning to ground everyone in the topic of air toxics. And then, as Anna said, she will go into more detail about a potential screening process and the possible method used to develop screening thresholds. This will get a bit technical, as Bennett said, because these are technical topics. And if there is some information that you feel you're lacking to fully participate or provide feedback, please reach out and let myself or Bennett know what would be helpful to know more about. And then we can look at whether we can provide that in a separate meeting or over email. And then especially if there's a group of people that would like to have a presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to Bennett, who is now the primary contact for those types of requests. We know that these can be very specific areas of knowledge, and it can be challenging just to fully take it in one presentation. So here is our agenda for this presentation. We'll go through a few definitions of terms that will be mentioned, and then provide context on air toxics and why we're working on these rules now. Then I will provide a brief overview of what the MPCA has been directed to do for air toxics regulations, including a summary of the statute, where we're at in the rulemaking process and timeline. And then we'll move to an overview of the concepts we are considering for these rules. We'll cover the rules structure flowchart that we are considering. It is a high-level conceptual overview of what they could look like. And then we have the material that is newer to this presentation, and Anna Cinco will go through the potential air toxics screening thresholds. Lastly, we have a list of questions that we at MPCA would appreciate your input on to help guide our direction around these ideas that we're working on. And we really just want to encourage everyone to be involved in the rulemaking process to help us work out potential issues before we have a draft of the rules. And then, as was mentioned earlier, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat as we go along. And we should also have time at the end to try and answer questions if we have answers for them at this time. And I'll also just mention, I don't have a view of the chat, so if I'm missing something and somebody needs to ping me, please just do so. All right, a few terms that are used in this presentation are included here, and I will read through these for all of us. Rulemaking is the process used by government agencies to create, modify, or repeal rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are a form of administrative law that governs the conduct of individuals, businesses, and other entities within the jurisdiction of the relevant government agency. And we're going through the rulemaking process for air toxics. And air toxics are pollutants that are known or suspected to cause cancer or other serious health effects or adverse environmental effects. And then we have hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, and these are a specific set of air toxics. And they are 188 air toxics that are defined in the Federal Clean Air Act. And then in discussing the concepts for the rules and in the questions that we're seeking feedback on, you'll hear us talk about inhalation health benchmarks. And an inhalation health benchmark is also known as an air guidance value. These are concentrations of a chemical that is likely to pose little or no risk to human health. These values are used in analyses to determine human health risks from exposures to chemicals in the air. And then last, we have criteria pollutants. They are 6 commonly found air pollutants that have ambient air standards as required in the Federal Clean Air Act. They include carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulates, and sulfur dioxide. And there's an asterisk by lead because it is also an air toxic. And as a little more context around air toxics and what they are, we have examples on this slide where air toxics can include metals, dioxin, furans, benzene, PFAS, otherwise known as forever chemicals, TCE, and more. Impacts from air toxics can include cancer, but it depends on the toxic. Not all of them have a cancer endpoint. They can include respiratory issues, cardiovascular issues, and other health effects. Sources of air toxics can include combustion, wildfires, transportation, solvents, and others. For some context on where we currently have authority on the 188 hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, this comes from the Federal Clean Air Act. This slide is a very high-level overview of some of the Clean Air Act, including that it was enacted or established in 1970. It provides authority on the federal level to regulate air pollution. It largely regulates 6 pollutants known as the criteria pollutants. And it also provided authority to establish national standards for hazardous air pollutants, or NESHAPs. The Clean Air Act was amended in 1990. Those are referred to as the 1990 amendments. And that established the list of HAPs that was originally 189 chemicals, and it established the authority to regulate them. EPA was directed to adopt air toxics control standards, where they had to identify industrial sources emitting HAPs, identify maximum achievable control technologies, or MACTs, and they had to conduct risk assessments afterwards to ensure that those standards were protective. And today there have been some changes to that list, and currently there are 188 HAPs. And we as a state are delegated to enforce those standards, those NESHAPs that EPA created for the 188 HAPs. And the graph on the right is from EPA. It shows the trend of the 6 criteria pollutants going down over time, and the gross domestic product going up, implying that we can control and decrease pollution while our economic health also goes up. And that is the goal. So we have some authority on the federal level to regulate HAPs through the Clean Air Act. Why are we doing this rulemaking now more broadly for air toxics? MPCA implements federal air toxics regulations. It's important to know that these are the minimum that regulated facilities must meet. The Clean Air Act does not limit states' authority to regulate air pollution, and states can have more stringent or more environmentally protective laws and requirements. There are geographic and economic differences in every state, and states will look at local needs to create more rules. And that is what the Minnesota State Legislature did. And so therefore, they found that there was a need in Minnesota to have state air toxics rules. And so MPCA was directed by the legislature to do this rulemaking. And that is the most simple answer, or most direct, of why we're doing this today. This is the first rulemaking of its kind in Minnesota, where we are directed to regulate a breadth of air toxics. MPCA has voluntary efforts around air toxics that work towards reducing pollution, but again, those have only been voluntary actions that a facility would take. And since federal regulations do not necessarily cover every pollutant, just the 188 HAPs, these rules will hopefully improve air quality in the metro, which is where the rules will apply. And so moving forward with this direction that we were given by the Minnesota State Legislature. This slide provides an overview of some of the details in the statute and the session law. And that statute required that the commissioner adopt rules to, quote, implement and govern regulation of facilities that emit air toxics. We had some restrictions laid out for us, and those include that we are on a 3-year timeline. We have to get our draft rules on notice of intent to adopt by May 18th, 2026. That's the latest date that we can have them on notice. We're still in the development stage working on what those rules could potentially look like. The rules will only be applicable to the 7 metro area counties. They are not limited to only environmental justice areas. I point that out because there are other rulemakings happening where that is the case, but these rules will apply to everywhere within these 7 counties listed here. They will not apply to facilities with registration option B permits. And those registration option B permits are for sources that purchase or use less than 2,000 gallons of VOC containing materials on a calendar year basis. And in the metro area, those are mostly auto body repair shops. On the right side of the slide, there are things that we were directed in the statute to address at a minimum. And it specifically said at a minimum, so it sets the floor for our efforts and not the ceiling. And we are directed to address specific air toxics, types of facilities, performance tests, monitoring of emissions, reporting requirements, record keeping, inspection frequency. And then we are directed that the rules must reflect these sub-bullets of risks to human health and the environment, a facility's compliance record, and residents' exposure in environmental justice areas. And so during previous informal comment periods, we had asked for specific input on this last point of how do we accomplish the rules reflecting residents' exposure in environmental justice areas. We're bringing that question back because we'd like to continue receiving input on this because again, the rules will apply to everywhere in the 7 county areas. So we just like some feedback on how to work out this nuance. And this is a broad overview of the timeline for this rulemaking. We're past the formal request for comments period. We're still in the development phase of the process. We're working on concepts. We are hoping to receive feedback from the public. And so we really want to hear from you all, and we want to hear from the people who will be impacted by these rules. And previously, we had a few informal comment periods in the last year, associated also with webinars that are recorded. And we posted the responses to questions that we received. Those comments are available on our rulemaking webpage. You can check those out if you're curious to see what other people have submitted so far. And that feedback from those comments really helped guide discussions and continue to provide perspective while we looked into and discuss possible concept options. And even though they were at this point several months ago, up to a year ago, that we received some of those comments, we still go back and reference them as we revisit different ideas to see what perspectives people have provided. Okay, so we're gonna get into a little more specific details about the concepts for the rules, and then specifically the screening ideas that we have. And we want to preface this that all of this information is conceptual. We appreciate everyone's time and contributions to this effort. We're really hoping for feedback on the conceptual framework and other ideas so far. The terminology that we're using is specific to this rulemaking process. We've kind of tweaked it a little bit just to hopefully make it more clear that it's about this process and not other things that may be being discussed more prevalently at this time. We do not have any proposed rule language to respond to at this point yet. We're still working out everything. And again, this is all draft, all conceptual. No final decisions have been made. Okay, and then before getting into the concepts specifically, I'm going to walk us through some of the new questions that we're looking for feedback on so that you can have them in mind as we go through that conceptual material to maybe spark some ideas for feedback. So the MPCA is considering the method that we will present on to develop the screening thresholds. Are there other examples of methodologies you've seen or adjustments you'd recommend? Are there other sources for inhalation health benchmarks you'd recommend other than those that Anna will present on? Do you foresee there being issues in the screening process for regulated parties? What are those issues and how could they be mitigated or avoided? Is there a preferred way to determine if a facility is above or below thresholds, other than something like a screening spreadsheet tool? For the screening threshold analysis, how many years of actual emissions data should be evaluated to determine if a facility is above or below thresholds? That could be 1 year, 2 years, however many years, etc. Should facilities be required to notify surrounding residents at any point in the implementation process? If so, at what point in the process should they be notified? Would or should facilities be required to public notice any changes made and or hold a public meeting? If so, at what point in the process should the public notice or meeting occur? And then what other topics related to this rulemaking would you like more information on? That could be compliance and enforcement, community engagement, environmental justice, or other topics. So those are the new questions that we're looking for feedback on. All right, I'll walk us through this draft rules structure flowchart. This is a conceptual framework. It outlines how we're looking to potentially structure the rules in Minnesota. This is similar to rules from other states. And it does not include all the details, like where there may be exemptions. And there are some key terms with their acronyms spelled out in the lower right of the slide. I'll walk us through the steps of this flowchart, and then Anna will get more detailed with the first stage that you'll see circled here around screening. So the first step is a screening analysis. Facilities or regulated parties would calculate their actual emissions, their actual air toxics emissions, and they would gather stack data to do that. They then would compare those emissions to screening thresholds, which Anna will again talk about how those thresholds could potentially be developed. If emissions are below the screening thresholds, there's no further action needed. And if air toxics are above the thresholds, then there are two options that informally in this presentation we're referring to as part of stage 2. So the first option there is that facilities could make operational changes and or take permit limits to get and stay below thresholds. And this could possibly be done using a potential and what would be a new tool for compliance and enforcement called a Compliance Determination Protocol, or CDP. The other option is that facilities could model to show risks. This is also called an ERA, or an air emissions risk analysis. So this would be a second analysis, a risk analysis that could be required for or chosen to be completed by a facility. And if a facility does a risk analysis, it's a little more involved, and they would use potential emissions as opposed to actual emissions, whereas in screening, a facility would use actual air toxics emissions. And then they would compare their modeled emissions to risk values in an ERA. If emissions are below risk levels, no further action is needed. And if they are above risk levels, they would potentially need to make operational changes and or take permit limits to reduce risk and or develop an air toxics reduction plan, which would also possibly be a new compliance tool, that ATRP. So this flowchart shows the broad overview of the rule structure that we are considering. And then Anna will go into the more conceptual details around that first stage and what we are considering in developing the screening values and the screening process. So I'll hand it over to Anna.
Great. Thanks, Cassandra.
Welcome.
Yeah. So I'm going to go over the stage 1, which we're calling for the screening threshold. So I'll talk about a possible tool that is in development to determine if a facility is above or below thresholds. And then I'll go into more technical detail about how the threshold values were developed. This was done by using air dispersion modeling, as well as inhalation health benchmarks. And then I will go over the equations used. And finally, we have an estimated number of facilities that could potentially be what we called screened in or move on to stage 2. So going to the next slide, please. So what is stage 1? So this screening threshold step is what facilities would do is they would use their actual emissions and they would compare them to the screening threshold value per air toxic. So if the emissions are greater than that threshold value, then the facility would have to move on to stage 2. So next step, we're going to look at a possible tool that's in development that could be used to compare actual emissions to those threshold values. And then again, I'll discuss how those threshold values were developed. Moving to the next slide, thanks. So yeah, this tool for stage 1, it's a draft screening threshold spreadsheet. It's being developed. The thought is it's just an easy tool for facilities to input their information, and then they can easily see if they are above or below threshold values. So facility would have to enter their stack height in feet, the distance to property line in meters, hourly and yearly emissions in pounds per hour and tons per year. And then the facility would also have to know their hours of operation to calculate those pound per hour values. And then from there, the spreadsheet would be able to compare those emission values per stack to that threshold value, and then it would determine if the facility is above or below thresholds. So just a conceptual idea that we have. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go into how these threshold values were developed. So it started with air dispersion modeling. And so a stack was placed in each of the 7 counties. AirMod was used to model these stacks. And these stacks were roughly placed in the center of each county, just visually looking at the county. And then once the stack was placed, it was made sure it wasn't on a current facility and or a body of water. And so the model was run then for each of the 7 counties. And averaging times used were 1 hour, 24 hours, and annually. And the terrain and meteorological data depended on the stack location. The meteorological data used was for 2018 to 2022. And then the table shows some parameters that were also used in the modeling. So some constant parameters were emission rate of 1 gram per second, a stack diameter of 1 foot, exit velocity of 0.001 meters per second, an exit temperature of 0 degrees Kelvin, also known as ambient temperature, and then the different stack heights that were modeled are in this table. So, in addition to the stack, 1 building was placed east of the stack. The thought behind that is most facilities have at least 1 other building on their property. The building was placed east of the stack, given that most of the wind has a westerly flow, so it comes from the west. Additionally, 1,332 receptors were placed. They were placed in a polar receptor grid centered on that stack. They were placed every 36 radials, every 10 degrees, and they were placed from 5 meters to 2,000 meters. So then once the model was ran for every single county, every single stack height, then the average for the 7 counties was taken for a given stack height and distance to receptor. So the model output units were in micrograms per meter cubed per gram per second, but then those had to be converted to micrograms per meter cubed per pound per hour for the 1 hour and 24-hour results, as well as micrograms per meter cubed per tons per year for the annual results. The other piece to calculating these threshold values was the inhalation health benchmarks. So some sources of inhalation health benchmarks include the Minnesota Department of Health's health-based values, the MDH's intrusion screening values, MDH's risk assessment advice, as well as EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, also known as IRIS, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, also known as ATSDR, EPA's Provisional Peer-Reviewed Toxicity Values, PPRTVs, and California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, Cal-EPA, and then there are a few MPCA values. We do have a Tableau workbook that's labeled air toxicity values, which just means the inhalation health benchmarks that we currently use in our risk assessment screening spreadsheet, which is our RAS. We use our RAS for our air emission risk analysis, an ERA that was previously talked about. And just to be clear, the potential screening spreadsheet that we would develop would be different than this RAS spreadsheet. So just a clarification there. All right. So the inhalation health benchmarks that we used were the acute, chronic, and cancer values to calculate the thresholds. Both reference concentrations, also known as RFCs, and inhalation unit risk, also known as IURs, were used. So acute inhalation health benchmarks, also denoted as RFC acute, were used to calculate the hourly threshold in pound per hour. The chronic, the RFC chronic, and the cancer, also known as IUR values, were used to calculate those yearly thresholds in tons per year. For calculating yearly thresholds, if a pollutant had an IUR and an RFC chronic, the lower of the two values would be used then to calculate the threshold value. So moving on, we'll go into the equations on how these values were calculated. So we'll start with the hourly threshold calculations. Those are in pounds per hour. There's two different equations that we use to calculate these threshold values. So the first equation we have is taking that reference concentration acute, RFC acute, and dividing by the model dispersion value, the hourly one. And then the second equation is taking that RFC acute and dividing by that model dispersion value for the 24 hours. And there's a difference in this because some of those RFC acute values were derived for different time averaging, so that's why there are two separate equations that we used for this. Moving on to the yearly calculations. So the first equation that we used to calculate the yearly threshold is looking at using the RFC chronic. To calculate the yearly threshold value, we take the RFC chronic and divide that by the annual model dispersion value. And then this gives us a yearly threshold value. And then if we go to the next slide, please. These are the two equations that were used using the cancer value, also known as the IUR. Since the units of the inhalation unit risk factor, IUR, are in micrograms per meter cubed to the -1, we have to take 1 times 10 to the -5 and divide that by the IUR. So that's why these equations are a little bit different than using the reference concentration on the previous slide. We're still using that same annual model dispersion value here. And then additionally, we apply an age-dependent adjusted factor, also known as an ADAF, to some of the IURs. This is because some of those IURs were derived where early life exposure was not accounted for. And so we apply that age-dependent adjustment factor to include that in our assessment. So lastly, so we have a rough estimate of, tentative facilities that would maybe move on to stage 2. Again, this is a rough estimate of the facilities in the 7-county metro. To get this estimate, we used 2020 air toxics emission inventory information. And, not all facilities report this information. As you can see in the table, there's about 669 facilities in the 7-county metro. We were only able to evaluate 563 of those. That's because either facilities didn't report any emissions or the emissions reported were criteria pollutants, and so we weren't able to evaluate them for this evaluation. And again, this is only an estimate as voluntary is reporting, and not all facilities report at this time. Additionally, stack height and distance to property line were estimated specifically for registration permits, where we used the SCC code to estimate the stack height for those stacks. And so we are tentatively estimating about 18% of facilities would move on to that stage 2, or what we would call screen in. And I believe that is all I have for the technical part of this.
Thanks, Anna. So again, we want to reiterate that all of this information is conceptual, even some of the terminology that we're using. We don't have any proposed rule language to respond to yet, and we are hoping for feedback on these ideas, and we appreciate all of your time and contributions to this effort. So here we have, again, specific questions that we are looking for responses to that will be available on our Smart comment page. You will be able to answer any number of them and or all of them. We also will have a catch-all question for you to provide any additional feedback that we didn't specifically cover in these questions. There are 2 slides of questions. And this first slide is there are questions that we previously asked in our informal comment periods. So we're bringing them back to continue receiving feedback on these ones. So first one is, should the MPCA limit/regulate air toxics where there are no inhalation health benchmarks established, such as specific PFAS? And if so, please provide those air toxics. Are there sources that should be exempt from air toxics rules? If so, what criteria should determine this? And we have some examples listed there. According to the statute, the rules must account for any exposure of residents in environmental justice areas to a facility's air toxics emissions in the 7-county metro area. How do you recommend accomplishing this? How much effort do you expect will be required to complete the screening threshold analysis? And if you work for a facility, what actions would you be willing to take to get and stay below screening thresholds? For example, moving or changing stacks, other sorts of operational changes versus moving on to complete an ERA or choosing to complete an ERA. And this slide contains the new questions that we're asking and that we went over earlier in this presentation. The MPCA is considering the method just presented to develop the screening so far for this rulemaking. Are there other examples of methodologies you've seen or adjustments that you'd recommend? Are there other sources for inhalation health benchmarks that you'd recommend? Where do you foresee there being issues in the screening process for regulated parties? What are those issues and how could they be mitigated or avoided? If there is a preferred way to determine if a facility is above or below thresholds, or is there a preferred way to determine if a facility is above or below thresholds other than a screening spreadsheet tool? For the screening threshold analyses, how many years of actual emissions data should be evaluated to determine if a facility is above or below thresholds? 1 year, 2 years, etc. Should facilities be required to notify surrounding residents at any point in this process? And if so, at what point in the process should they be notified? Should facilities be required to public notice any changes that are made and or hold a public meeting? If so, at what point in the process should there be a public notice or a meeting? What other topics related to this rulemaking would you like more information on? That could include compliance and enforcement, community engagement, environmental justice, etc. It's open to where your interests are and where you'd like more information. So those are the questions that we're asking on our Smart comment page. And aside from those, we're also asking now if you have any preferences for how you want to be engaged, if there are other ways to reach you or other people that we should be involving, or if there is additional information or updates that you'd like to see. And send those ideas and preferences to Bennett Alupo. He is the engagement specialist for this rulemaking, and his contact information is here. And I'll just pause for a second so you can screenshot or take down his contact info. We want to make sure that we're able to connect with people in ways that work for all of us and that we're providing the information that is helpful to you. And here's how to get to the Smart comment page. There's the QR code, so you can use your phone's camera app to navigate there. There's also a direct web address that we can drop in the chat. And then also on the right is an example of what that first page of the smart comment should look like. Just under where you include your contact information, you can scroll through the different questions. This will be open now through April 20th, 2025. And again, you can provide feedback on any of the questions, one of the questions, all of the questions. And we encourage you to provide written feedback because then it gives us time to really take it in and make sure that we're able to really process and consider the information that you're providing. But also, we can take your questions and your input now through the chat or verbally if you want to use your use the raise hand function in Zoom. And lastly, before getting to any questions or possible feedback, we want to encourage people to sign up for our email listserv. Again, here's a QR code. This one will navigate, help you navigate to the rulemaking webpage for air toxics regulations. There's also the link at the bottom to the direct page that we can drop in the chat. And then you would just scroll to down in that webpage and enter your email address in the Stay Connected box and hit subscribe. So thank you for joining us today. This is our contact information for myself, for Anna, for Bennett. And thank you to Hannah, who's providing the amazing behind the scenes tech support that's much needed for providing a webinar presentation. And thank you again. And I'll turn it back over to Bennett to help facilitate any feedback that may come through at this time.
Hi, how's everybody doing? I hope y'all enjoyed the presentation. Thank you, Cassandra and Anna, for leading this. And I want to open the floor to see if anybody has any verbal questions or any questions in the chat. And you could raise your hand if you do have a question. Yep, Rama?
Yeah, I have a question. Any of these regulations include indoor air toxins?
I will pass it on to Cassandra for that.
No, these regulations are specifically from sources that leave a facility. So it wouldn't cover anything internally. That is covered by OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, MIN-OSHA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
So it is only the outdoor emissions, you say?
Yep. Anything that leaves the building's or the facility's property.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we also have a question from John Frost. Will there be communications to the conceptually flagged facilities that did not pass the first tier screen? And I believe Hannah is going to paste this into the chat as well, so then we can read it. And I'll repeat it one more time. Will there be communications to the conceptually flagged facilities that did not pass the first tier screen?
I don't believe that we've talked about that because at this time, at least, we're considering, it's not final, that facilities would do this analysis for themselves because there was so much that we estimated and just assumed that we didn't know for sure about specific facilities. And so we're considering that facilities would do this analysis themselves, and then they would potentially alert the MPCA if they find that they screen in. But we are open to suggestions if you have other ways for us to consider.
And then while we're on this, did anybody have a response to that question before we move on to G. Williams? And I'll give it a couple seconds.
No, there was just a little bit of confusion on the back end as I was copying in smart comment link. John and I have just been going back and forth. That was actually directed for the whole group. So hopefully we answered your question, John, but if you have anything else, feel free to reply back to me.
Awesome. Thank you. G. Williams, what question do you have or comment?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, the question I was wondering is, so for this new potential emissions reporting, is this going to be, for like emergency backup generation or for facilities that are doing air permitting for like power or peak shave operations, there's already a kind of a form that we fill out for air toxins. Is this going to be different from that? Or is this going to be something in addition to that, or is this going to replace that? Is that, I guess, a lot of questions there.
Sorry, I got kicked out. I don't know if I.
I think everybody got dropped.
Yeah, I'm about to say I didn't hear anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we got reconnected.
Do you want to give it?
Yeah,
I wasn't watching to see how many participants were on before. I know we started with around like 96.
Yeah, we've got 76. Not everyone dropped off. I know I stayed on
Okay.
and a lot of participants did stay on, so I think you can probably
Okay.
go ahead. Not sure what happened. Sorry, guys.
Were you able to hear my question, or did it drop off when I'm in the middle of that?
I
It
think I
dropped
heard
off
your
in the
question.
middle
Thank you.
for me. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my question was, so currently with the like emergency backup diesel generation or spark ignited generation, there is an air inventory and regulation for each one of the air permits that we currently use. Is this going to be something that we're replacing that with, or is this something that we're going to use in tandem? I'm just kind of understanding how that would impact that current process that they're going on right now.
So I will say that I don't fully know what that process is, but I believe that this will be something that would be in addition to it, because these are rules and requirements that aren't in place currently. So the reporting that you do for those units exists, and this would be new. But if you want to drop in the chat what those forms are, we could take a look at them and just double check that we're not creating double work for people.
Yeah, definitely. If that email that you sent out, is that a good one to respond to? Because I could send those what we're using right now to that email as well. So the one
Yeah.
on the blue screen, I think that you had up there earlier.
Yes, I will reshare
Yep.
my screen as well.
Yeah, the reason why I bring it up is that that was something that we're currently doing when it comes to particulates, emission tonnage, CO2 greenhouse gases. All those things are already calculated off of that sheet for emergency and for the RICE NESHAP requirements.
Yeah, and for many air toxics, we don't require currently. There's a separate rulemaking process that's happening now for reporting air toxics. But for most facilities, it has been historically voluntary to report those air toxics. So this is probably going to be new, but I'd have to take a look at those
Okay.
forms.
Yeah, so I'll just send it to Cassandra right there.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. And John, I see your comment in the chat. We'll be able to share more information as the rule is developed as well. I wanted to open the floor to any more comments, any more questions. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes or 1 or 2 more minutes. Yep, Cassandra?
Yeah, I see a request in the chat from Jen to forward those emergency generator reference docs to me as well. Jen, could you, if you want to drop your contact information, either in the direct chat or you can send it directly to me or Bennett and we can forward that to you.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. It's been our pleasure being able to share the updates on the rulemaking process and what we've been thinking. I want to say thank you to Cassandra and Anna again, and also thank you for the questions at the end. Feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'll do what we can to answer your questions and give you more guidance as the rule develops. And we want to hear your input and feedback as we go along this process. Thank you again.